Welcome to the Museum of Florida History in Tallahassee. Witness the Quilters Unlimited Guild and a museum working together for a yearly event. Now, if we did a survey of the state with the most quilt makers, I do believe Florida would win. That is a testimony to the many people's desire to make a quilt legacy in their retirement years. We can find many of these quilts right inside this building. Then the letters C and D are examined in the how-to portion of lap quilting today.
Could you imagine a more clever object? Warms the body, ignites the mind. A child sleeps under mother's creation, together forever. The art of the heart and design of the mind puts you to bed one day at a time. The art of the heart and design of the mind.
It is a pleasure today to introduce Carol Sheppard of the Museum of Florida History. Carol, what is your official title and what do you do here?
Well, officially I'm the volunteer coordinator for the museum, and as such I work with a great many wonderful volunteers, and that embraces the volunteers who actually produce the quilt show in the form of the Quilters Unlimited of Tallahassee Guild. It's one of the great pleasures I have in my job to work with such a good group of people.
We're amazed at the variety and the different aspects that go on here at the museum. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the museum is very comprehensive for Florida history. We begin with a wonderful exhibit on Florida's prehistory. We have excellent collection of artifacts from the Spanish Plate Fleet collection, which are artifacts that were recovered from shipwrecks that occurred off the coast of Florida in the 16th, 17th centuries. We have a wonderful collection of flags from the Civil War era, some of which have been conserved and preserved to reflect Florida's participation in the Civil War. We have a reconstructed 1930s citrus packing house, which is everyone knows Florida has such a wonderful citrus industry behind its history. And we have a tin can camper, a reproduced version of a Model T Ford, which was sort of a forerunner of the RVs that we see on the highways today. People have been coming to Florida that way for a long time. One of the things the children enjoy so much is Grandma's Attic, a wonderful hands-on area. And we have an exhibit on Florida's waterways. So we're pleased to put all of this together in the context of the history of the people of Florida. And we feel the quilts add a wonderful touch of human warmth and personal stories to all of that story that we like to tell.
Well, we look forward to meeting Janice now and learning more about the quilt exhibit and seeing the stars of the show. That's the quilts.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Janice Parker is chairman of this year's quilt show here in Tallahassee, Florida. Tell us about the history and the new name.
This is the 19th annual Capital City Quilt Show. That's our new name, and we have been in this venue in the Museum of Florida History for 16 years. Before that, we had a couple of weekend wonders, and then had the opportunity to come into this beautiful museum and to have it up for a whole month.
And new quilts each year.
Each quilter can put in several quilts, but they have to have never been in the show before. Occasionally we make an exception, but most of the time it's brand new quilts.
Do not let me forget to buy a ticket on this opportunity quilt. Tell me about it.
Each year, Quilters Unlimited has a committee that comes up with a design, and normally they hand out fabric or packets or instructions, and all of the members of Quilters Unlimited construct the blocks, put it together, and then take turns quilting on it until it's finished. And we use it as a fundraiser to fund guild activities and to subsidize scholarships.
And the Guild supports charitable projects here in the community also?
We have many quilters in our guild that belong to several different groups. McQuilters, which benefits Ronald McDonald House. They raise money and do commissions, and all the proceeds go back to the Ronald McDonald House. We also have a new group that helps to create quilts for the hospice, the new hospice house here in Tallahassee. There's also a display called the Wall of Dreams at Tallahassee Memorial Hospital in the neonatal unit, and it's baby blankets that our members have made that are permanently displayed so that patients or parents of patients, when they go up there, have something pleasant to look at.
More beauty on the walls, and I'm anxious to see the beautiful quilt, so let's take a view.
Okay.
What is a quilt show without a cat quilt?
Yeah, this quilt was made by one of our QU members. Her name's Sherry Gleaves, and she's an internet junkie, and it was a block swap from an internet site that she belongs to where they exchanged cat blocks.
And of course, also, jar quilts are everywhere.
Marianne Crawford made this for her son on his 16th birthday, and the jars contain 16 of his favorite things.
It's unusual to see an airplane quilt at a show. There must be a story here.
Joy Donahue found this pattern, and she did it to commemorate her son-in-law's flight in an F-16. He had always wanted to fly in one. He was finally able to, so she made this quilt kind of as a commemorative.
Talk about school children on a quilt. Janice, what's the story here?
Well, Dee Dee Snow works at the Brookwood School in Georgia, and she did this as a fundraiser. Each of the children on the quilt represents one of the children in the school, and the parents got together and raised $13,000 and paid for this quilt in auction, and now they donated it back to the school, and it hangs in their lobby.
Well, that's a happy story. And now we got a big kick out of the Z quilt. Tell us about that one.
Dee Dee Harder and her partner Doug kind of have a little fighting match going. He snores and she can't stand it. So she made this quilt to commemorate him, and she says that she sends him to the couch with it whenever it gets too loud.
It's a great quilt. There must be a beautiful story behind this tree quilt, and we know that this is honoring the hospice house.
This quilt was made and donated by the Caring Tree Quilters. They're a group that meets at the hospice house here in Tallahassee, and it is to hang in their lobby. The quilters donated it. Was all hand appliqued and hand quilted, and they just are a very caring group of ladies who use their talents to help the patients at the hospice house.
Well, it's a beautiful quilt in its simplicity.
It's just gorgeous. This quilt was made for Caroline Collins by her sit and stitch group called the Friday Frayed Edges. Several months before, a tree fell into her house in the middle of the night, and she had gotten out of her bed right before then. And the broken log cabin blocks and the houses kind of represent that theme, and the guardian angel watching over her who got her out of bed. And we presented this quilt to her at the opening night of the quilt show. It was a complete surprise, and she was just boiled over. It was great.
That's great.
This one is called Celtic Dreams, and it was a commission for one of our QU members who is a hand-dyed artist. She does hand dyeing of fabric, and the creator is named Linda O'Sullivan, and she is from Wales and just loves all things Celtic and just does a beautiful job. And if you look at the detailed handcrafting, you can see all the individual appliqued claws. There are hundreds of them on the quilt, and it's just an exquisite work of art. This quilt is called Imaginette Plantagenet, and it's made by Bird Tribble, who's a very talented quilter, and she is also a history buff. She has a master's in history and created it using all Liberty of London fabrics. It's meant to represent the pageantry of Eleanor of Aquitaine's reign. And she just is an exquisite quilter, and you see all the kaleidoscope effects. It's just gorgeous.
Did you find that jar quilt in the show? Mine are still unfinished. We made them at Freedom Escape and exchanged, and they might get into a quilt someday. Now back to the quilter's alphabet. We are covering C and D today. C is for Cathedral quilt or Cathedral window quilt. It is a novelty coverlet of layered material with scrap fabric squares which become the windows that are inserted into muslin squares, sometimes called the year quilt, because it takes a year to make. It's nothing more than muslin folded into a rectangle from a square, and then you pull that apart, meeting the seams, and stitch across, leaving an opening. When that's turned inside out, you have squares with bias sides, but they're all folded and no raw edges. You then stitch those together, and the little 2.5-inch square here becomes the window that is placed inside, and that bias edge folds back so easily. And then you just keep adding squares, and in a year you'll have it done. C is for Catywhompus. When the top and bottom layers of a quilt shift or are askew, we sometimes say that things are cattywampus or that cattywampus has happened. Here's a good example on the edges of this quilt. Do you see how this fabric is shifting this way, and we especially see it on the back side when they're just going in opposite directions? Oh, that really bothers me. So I want to take out that thread and then rebase that so I get it all straight. C is for crosshatch. Those are diagonal and right angle straight lines created on the quilt top as a guide for hand or machine quilting. It sometimes becomes the filler behind applique designs also. This is an example of a heart quilt, an antique quilt that comes out every Christmas time in our home. And it's interesting to note that the cross-hatching here is done not only by machine, but some hand quilting also. She probably just got a sewing machine and was so proud she decided to show it off. In my husband's side of the family, this is a baby quilt that was handed down, done with triangles, but note that more machine quilting in cross-hatching on the back side. C is for crazy patch, a form of patchwork where odd shapes of fabric are attached to a foundation block via the sewing machine or by hand with embroidery stitches accenting the seam lines. What an elaborate example of Victorian crazy patch, complete with all the fancy stitches. Today we have updated it quite a bit. I owe a lot to crazy patch. I began making these handbags in New Orleans 30 years ago, and of course I still enjoy doing it, whether it's on a vest or whether it's making a jacket for the husband in this family. I took a tailoring class and this is the result. It works well for New Year's Eve. That's just about it. Technique-wise, I think we look to crazy patch as the sew in flip method. Quite often it's on a foundation. It could even be newspaper long ago. But we find that you can always start at the beginning, as in this red, and then it's sew and flip, sew and flip. Quite often that sew and flip makes you end up going up the creek, because then you don't know where to go next time. I like the idea of working on a more planned system, and I do use freezer paper. I like the gridded lines on the freezer paper because that indicates the grain line of the fabric. If you were doing vests or a handbag, you simply cut your pattern out of that gridded freezer paper and then code each of your sections. A1 would sew to A2. Now I have one in progress and you can see more or less how it's been done. One thing that happens with the freezer paper is that you are reversing the image when you get done. Here's A1, the A section, in progress. And what happens is once you cut those apart, you see how I've done some crossover clues? I would then go to my iron, and I'm getting ready to, because I've got a poly-coated side here, simply iron this on my fabric. I'm going to make certain that these lines line up with the grain line of my fabric. I would put my iron onto just dry heat. By the way, I've got it on steam right now, and you can, wow, do I have a new ironing system. I actually love to iron, so I treated myself to this, and it does everything. It really does. So I'm going to switch off just to dry heat, and I'm going to line this up, iron this in place, making certain that I have left enough fabric around the outside to give myself the seam allowance. Then with my ruler, let me move this aside, and I've already trimmed one. And by the way, if you're using silk fabric, you can see how I've placed a stabilizer on the back side of that. It gives it a little more body. Then I'm ready to simply trim off using my see-through ruler and getting my nice 1/4 inch on all sides. And once that's done, then I can do that pin and peak system. I know that I've gotten this, my last side, and I've pulled that aside, and then I can go back to those crossover clues, put the right sides together, and I simply pin that, making certain that my pins will reveal that my grid is all lined up. When I open this up, I can see how my grid aligns, and then I'm ready to sew. And I keep the paper right on there for stitching. Once it's been stitched, then I can pull those off. And then I'd be ready to attach my fancy stitches where the two fabrics connected. D is for dangling thread. In lap quilting, that is a quilting line left unfinished where the needle is removed to be rethreaded once the blocks or the rows are connected. Here's a quilt that I'm finishing, and this is the connecting edge, and I had to leave it unquilted at least a ½ inch. So you see that I have taken the needle out of all these threads, and then once I put the rows together, here's where the rows have come together, then I will rethread all of these loose threads and come all the way up and finish my quilting. D is for dog ears. These are the triangular extensions that just happen when pieces are sewn together. We always prune or trim those off, and then you just collect those. Now, some people can throw them away, but I like to collect them, and these are my famous dog ear jars. D is for diamond. In this case, a 45-degree diamond, as seen in 3 sizes of a scrap basket pattern. We're going to do some drafting. I've done it in a small, a medium, and a large. The medium, I named this quilt Portulaca. I was working on it in the summertime, and I was planning a summer garden, and the name just came to me. You might see this quilt featured in your quilt store around the country. They've pictured it and put it into a wonderful kit. Let's examine exactly how it was drafted. Diamonds are going to come into play many times in the patchwork world, and I think it's important to know how to do a Lemoyne star. This pattern is based on a Lemoyne star. Take any square, 6-inch, 12-inch, or whatever, and divide it on the diagonal from corner to corner 2 times. Whatever distance you get from that center to the right angle, in this case it's 8.5, you swing that around and go to your corner and then mark 8.5 right here and come up here and go from 8.5 right here. And what you're going to end up doing is creating, in the case of this square, 3.5-inch squares in each of the corners. Once that has been established, then I would introduce a 45-degree angle between these 2 distances. And if I come and just place the 45-degree angle and come right here and draw a line, swing that around, and find my 45 again, and draw another line. I need to have that right on the line, and then find a midpoint where that is. I have created a 45-degree diamond. Now, what's unique about that is that it is the same distance on all 4 sides, and what I think is so amazing is that the distance between those 2, in this case 5 inches, is always the distance on the diagonal of the corner square. That's how you can always tell at a quilt show, is that quilt based on a Lemoyne star pattern? Now, how did I come up with the scrap basket pattern? Well, I designed that Lemoyne star, and I took the diamond and divided it into a 4-patch. That's going to be the scrappy part. Then you can see the red dashed lines become the basket, the base of the basket, and then the triangle that is going to be the background color, and then I have that rectangle that comes out here. So even though I started with a 12-inch, this pattern actually ends up being a 10.5-inch. Let's examine how it's sewn and how it's put together. Of course, the fun part is doing the scrappy part. In this case, the 14.5-inch basket, it's the larger one. You start with strips of fabric, dark and light scraps, that are cut 2 1/4 inches wide. And of course, when you're getting ready to sew something together, I think it makes sense to just cut those out together. So I'd put the dark and the light together, cut 2.5-inch strips, open it up, and in this case, I like that center seam pressed open. Then I put the two sides together, and you can either put the wrong side or the right side together. And once again, I introduce that 45-degree angle again, and I'm cutting these apart 2 1/4. So once I have cut those apart, and I do a whole lot of scraps, as you can tell, then I can actually find where this one was represented. So as far as sewing it together, then you would start with, as always, your smallest pieces first. In this case, it is the diamonds. And here is where I go to the sewing machine, and pin and peeking is important. You know you're going to have a dog ear eking off of each side, and once you've pinned that center and opened it up, well, it's a little too far this way, so then I would unpin and move it just a hair this way, and I always make sure to pin exactly where I'm going to sew so that when I open that up, see how it's lined up now? So then I can come and relying on my patchwork foot, in this case it's number 37, on my machine, I'm then getting ready to sew all the way down, and I do remove my pins. I like to use a little stiletto, which in this case is my seam ripper, that helps me sew that all the way down. And once I've sewn all of those, in this case there will be 4 sets, then it's optional whether or not you go ahead and press those open again. In this case, it might balance the weight of your fabric a little bit better. After these have been sewn together, here's one that's been sewn, then you're going to go to your triangles. And I always say, if I have a chance to come ahead and line up a 45-degree angle, I will do it. Now, one of the keys in sewing this block together is at this inside right angle, you do not sew out to the raw edge, only come to that 1/4 inch. Do you see the 1/4 inch? Stop and back stitch. But at this time, I can then line those 45-degree angles up, press that back, crease it with your thumb, and then I know I'm ready to start stitching right there. And I like to make sure that I back stitch at that inside right angle. So I've lined that up, start, back stitch 3 stitches, and then I'm ready to go. And hold this down here. Do you see by holding that little pointy thing, you know nothing's going to shift. You also want to make sure that these seams, if you press them open, that they stay all the way down. So I'd continue that all the way to the end, and of course, you know what you're going to come up with here. You're going to come up with a dog ear, aren't you? So I'd get rid of that, and once that's done, then I swing this around, and then I'm ready to start again. And you see where I've gone to here, stop and back stitch, and I'm getting ready to go all the way down here. Now let me show you what happens next after you've stitched this. Let's pretend I've got all of this stitched. Then you can go back and put this in place again, and when that's in place, because that dog ear has been trimmed off, I have a perfect 90-degree angle. This allows me to line up my corner square and sew all the way and swing this around. Of course, I would get this whole section put together first. And of course, all that's left then is your large triangle, which is your basket, these corner pieces, the sides, and then your end background fabric. See you next time on Lap Quilting from Georgia to Germany.
Closed caption made possible by Omnigrid, manufacturer of the original patented black and yellow rulers and green cutting mats. And Collins, well known for notions and tools for quilt makers. For more information about patterns and designs shown on this series, Visit Georgia at www.georgiabonesteel.com. Lap quilting with Georgia Bonesteel is made possible in part by grants from Bernina, makers of sewing machines manufactured with the care of traditional Swiss workmanship. Nothing sews like a Bernina. Nothing. By Gamel Quilting Machine Company, offering 4 sizes of long-arm hand-guided machines to quilters worldwide. By Coates & Clark, America's #1 name in sewing, hand knitting, and craft products. By Martingale & Company, home of That Patchwork Place, publisher of America's best-loved craft and hobby books. By Hobbs Bonded Fibers, maker of heirloom premium cotton and wool batting, with a package labeling system to help quilters select the correct batting for specific projects. And by Horn of America, cabinets of the future today.